नारायण गोसाई महाराज श्री गुरुदेव की जय। नितिल प्रविष्ट विष्णुपाद अष्टतर शतस्मर श्री भक्ति वेदांत वामन गोसाई महाराज की जय। नितिल प्रविष्ट विष्णुपाद अष्टतर शतस्मर श्री भक्ति वेदांत साई महाराज श्री प्रभुपाद की जय। नितिल प्रविष्ट विष्णुपाद अष्टतर शतस्मर श्री भक्ति प्रज्ञान केशव गोसाई महाराज की जय। नितिल प्रविष्ट विष्णुपाद अष्टतर शतस्मर श्री भक्ति सिद्धांत साई प्रभुपाद की जय। नितिल प्रविष्ट महाभागवत श्री गोक्षर बाबाजी महाराज की जय। नितिल प्रविष्ट श्री सच्चिदानंद भक्ति विनोद ठाकुर की जय। नितिल प्रविष्ट वैष्णव सार्वभौम श्री जगन्नाथ दास बाबाजी महाराज की जय। श्री रूप गौरिया गुरु वर्ग की जय। श्री रूप सनातन भट्ट रघुनाथ श्री जीव गोपाल पतदास रघुनाथ शारद गोसाई प्रभु की जय। श्री स्वरूप दामोदर राय रामानंदारी श्री गौर प्रसाद वृंद की जय। नाम आचार्य श्री हरिदास ठाकुर की जय। प्रेम से कहो श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर श्रीवासरी गौर भक्त वृंद की जय। श्री क्षेत्र मंडल गौर मंडल ब्रज मंडल मथुर वृंदावन धाम की जय। सर्व अभिष्ट व्रत गिरिराज महाराज की जय। श्री राधा कुंड श्याम कुंड की जय। श्री मुन देवी गंगा देवी की जय। श्री तुलसी महारानी वृंद देवी की जय। श्री भक्ति देवी की जय। श्री पूर्णमासी योगमाया की जय। श्री गोपेश्वर महादेव की जय। श्री हरिनाम संकीर्तन की जय। श्री पृथु महाराज की जय। श्री अर्ची देवी की जय। ग्रंथराज श्रीमद्-भागवतम की जय। श्री निताई गौर प्रेमानंदे हरि हरि बोल। धन्यवाद प्रणाम हरि बोल। धन्यवाद प्रणाम प्रजुम्न प्रभु रासेश्वरी माता जी, Madhavi Didi, Indira Mataji, Gargaraj ji, and also Mantara Murthy Mataji. Haribo. Dandava pranams. Oh, and I realized, well, somebody let me know that I actually forgot to do the Mangalacharan one day. So whenever I do that, you can just remind me. Sometimes when I'm late, I just get ready in a rush, and I forget the Mangalacharan. Wait, is my screen sharing? Okay. Om Ajnanatirmirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha. Namo Om Vishnu Padaya Radhikaya Priyatmane Shri Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam Vedanta Narayaniti Namine. Namo Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prishtaya Bhutale Śrīmate Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namine. Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya eva cha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Namo Mahavadanyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gauratishe Namaha. Guruve Gaurachandraya Radhikaya Itadalaye Krishnaya Krishna Bhaktaya Tarbhaktaya Namo Namaha. Yang pravrajantam anupetam apeta krityam dvaipayano viraha katara ajuhava putreti tanmayataya taravo binedu stang sarvabhuta hridaya munimanatosmi narayanam namaskritya narang chaiva narottamam devim saraswatim vyasam tato jayam udirayet. Shrinvatang Swakata Krishna Punya Shavana Kirtana Hridantasto Yabhadrani Vidhunoti Suritsatam Nashta Prayeshvabhadreshu Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya Bhagavatuttama Shloke Bhaktir Bhavati Naishtaki Tavai Vasmi Najivami Tvaya Vina Iti Vigyaya Radhe Tvam Nayamang Charanantikam Bhaktya Vihina Aparada Lakshay Kshiptashtakama Ditarangamadhe Kripa Mai Tvam Sharanam Prapanna Vrinde Namaste Charana Ravindam Bhaja Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasari Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Okay, Mantra Murti. Okay, sorry about Mantra Murti Mataji, Dandavat Pranam. I was thinking that was an interesting name. Okay. So let's go over this summary of the 12 verses we read yesterday. Pṛthu's Vanaprastha life, his austerities, and departure. Pṛthu retires. Realizing his old age, Pṛthu, the maintainer of all kinds of living entities, having executed the orders of the Lord, handed over the earth to his sons. Then he went to the forest with his wife, while the citizens lamented in separation. Pṛthu's austerity, their purpose and results. There, in the forest, he underwent severe austerities according to the Vanaprastha rules as seriously as he engaged formally in leading the government and conquering. In the Tapovan, the forest for austerity, he sometimes ate roots, sometimes fruits and dried leaves, and for some weeks he drank only water. Finally, he lived simply by breathing air. And now the seasons. He placed fires around himself during the summer, exposed himself to torrents of rain during monsoon, stood in water up to his neck in the winter, and he used to sleep on the earth. He underwent all these austerities of controlling his words, senses, sexual impulse, and life airs only to satisfy Lord Krishna. By such austerities, he gradually became steadfast. He destroyed his karma and became joyful. He controlled his mind and senses by pranayam and cut his bondage to the world. He constantly worshipped the Lord by following the path of Adhyatma Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, as taught by Sanat Kumar. Thus his devotion to Lord Krishna became unflinching and fixed. Pṛthu destroys his subtle body. By such practice of bhakti, his mind became Shuddha Sattva, and he could constantly think of the Lord. In his purified mind appeared Gyan and Vairagya, by which he destroyed the subtle body and transcended all doubts. When he became free from all other conceptions of life, Pṛthu realized the form of Paramatma. Being without desire for cities, he destroyed his subtle body by Gyan and then gave up that Gyan. Unless yogis and jnanis become attracted to Krishna Katha, their illusions can never be dispelled. That's what we read up to yesterday. I just want to see what the Srila Prabhupada's translation was here. When he became completely free from the conception of bodily life, Maharaj Pṛthu realized Lord Krishna sitting in everyone's heart as the Paramatma. Being thus able to get all instructions from him, he gave up all other practices of yoga and gyan. He was not even interested in the perfection of yoga of the yoga and gyan systems, for he thoroughly realized that devotional service to Krishna is the ultimate goal of life, and that unless the yogis and jnanis become attracted to Krishna Katha, narrations about Krishna, their illusions concerning existence can never be dispelled. All right. One second, I'll just drink some water. Evam savira pravara samyojatmanamatmani
Brahma bhuta dridam kale tatyaja swam kale varam. In due course of time, when Maharaj Pṛthu was to give up his body, he fixed his mind firmly on upon the lotus feet of Krishna, and thus, completely situated on the Brahmabhuta platform, he gave up the material body. Purport by Srila Prabhupada. According to a Bengali proverb, whatever spiritual progress one makes in life will be tested at the time of death. In Bhagavad Gita 8.6, it is also confirmed, Yam yam vapi smaram bhavam tyajatyante kalevaram tam tam evaiti konteya sadatar bhava bhavita. Those who are practicing Krishna consciousness know that their examination will be held at the time of death. If one can remember Krishna at death, he is immediately transferred to Goloka Vrindavan, or Krishna Loka, and thus his life becomes successful. Pṛthu Maharaj, by the grace of Krishna, could understand that the end of his life was near, and thus he became very jubilant and proceeded to completely give up his body on the Brahmabhuta stage by practicing the yogic process. It is thoroughly described in the following verses how one can voluntarily give up this body and return home back to Godhead. The yogic process practiced by Pṛthu Maharaj at the time of death accelerates the giving up of this body, while one is in sound health physically and mentally. Every devotee desires to give up the body while it is sound physically and mentally. This desire was also expressed by King Kulashekar in his Mukunda Mala Stotra. Krishna tvadiya parapankaja panjarantam adhyaiva me vishatu manasaraja hangsa prana prayana samaye kapavata pita kantavarodhana vidho smaranam kutaste. King Kulashekar wanted to give up his body while in a healthy state, and he thus prayed to Krishna to let him die immediately while he was in good health and while his mind was sound. When a man dies, he is generally overpowered by mucus and bile, and thus he chokes. Since it is very difficult to vibrate any sound while choking, it is simply by Krishna's grace that one can chant Hare Krishna at the time of death. However, by situating oneself in the muktasana position, a yogi can immediately give up his body and go to whatever planet he desires. A perfect yogi can give up his body whenever he desires through the practice of yoga. It's reminding me of the last verse of Gurudev Bodo Kripa Kori. Vardhake ekon pancharoge hata keme bhajibo bolo. Anyways, sampidya payum pashnibhyam vayam utsarayan chanai nabhyam koteshvavastapya hriduro kantashirshani. When Maharaj Pṛthu practiced a particular yogic sitting posture, he blocked the doors of his anus with his ankles, pressed his right and left calves, and gradually raised his life air upward, passing it onto the circle of his navel, passing it onto the circle of his navel, up to his heart and throat, and finally pushed it upward to the central position between his two eyebrows. Purport. The sitting posture described herein is called muktasana. And the yoga process, after following the strict regulative principles controlling sleeping, eating, and mating, one is allowed to practice the different sitting postures. The ultimate aim of yoga is to enable one to give up this body according to his own free will. One who has attained the ultimate summit of yoga practice can live in the body as long as he likes, or as long as he is not completely perfect. Or, as long as he is not completely perfect, he can leave the body to go anywhere within or outside the universe. Some yogis leave their bodies to go to the higher planetary systems and enjoy the material facilities therein. However, intelligent yogis do not wish to waste their time with this material world at all. They do not care for the material facilities in higher planetary systems, but are interested in going directly to the spiritual sky, back home, back to Godhead. From the description in this verse, it appears that Maharaj Pṛthu had no desire to promote himself to the higher planetary systems. He wanted to return home immediately, back to Godhead. Although Maharaj Pṛthu stopped all practice of mystic yoga after realizing Krishna consciousness, he took advantage of his previous practice and immediately placed himself on the Brahma-bhuta platform in order to accelerate his return to Godhead. The aim of this particular system of asana, known as the sitting posture for liberation, or muktasana, is to attain success in Kundalini chakra and gradually raise the life from the Muladhara chakra to the Swadhisthana chakra, then to the Manipura chakra, the Anahata chakra, the Vishuddha chakra, and finally to the Agya chakra. When the yogi reaches the Agya chakra, between the two eyebrows, he is able to penetrate the Brahmarandra, or the hole in his skull, and go to any planet he desires, up to the spiritual kingdom of Vaikuntha, or Krishna Loka. The conclusion is that one has to come to the Brahma-bhuta stage for going back to Godhead. God, my eye is really hurting me. Yeah, sorry. However, those who are in Krishna consciousness, who are practicing bhakti yoga, Shravanam, Kirtanam, Vishnu Smaranam, Pada Sevanam, can return to Godhead without even practicing the Muktasan process. The purpose of Muktasan practice is to come to the Brahma-bhuta stage, for without being on the Brahma-bhuta stage, one cannot be promoted to the spiritual sky, as stated in Bhagavad Gita 14.26. Mam chayo vyabhicharena bhakti yogena sevate sagunan samatitaitan brahma bhuyaya kalpate. The bhakti yogi, the bhakti yoga practicing bhakti yoga, is always situated on the Brahma-bhuta stage, Brahma Bhuyaya Kalpate. If a devotee is able to continue on the Brahma-bhuta platform, he enters the spiritual sky automatically after death and returns to Godhead. Consequently, a devotee need not feel sorry for not having practiced the Kundalini chakra, or not penetrating the 6 chakras one after another. As far as Maharaj Pṛthu is concerned, he had already practiced this process, and since he did not want to wait for the time when his death would occur naturally, he took advantage of the Shat chakra penetration process and thus gave up the body according to his own free will and immediately entered the spiritual sky. Utsarpayang stutang murdhni kramenashpesha nispriha vayam vayokshito kayam tejasayujat. In this way, Pṛthu Maharaj gradually raised his air of life up to the hole in his skull, whereupon he lost all desire for material existence. Gradually, he merged his life with the totality of air, his body with the totality of earth, and the fire within his body with the totality of fire. Purport. When the spiritual spark, which is described as 1/10,000th part of the tip of the hair, is forced into material existence, that spark is covered by gross and subtle material elements. The material body is composed of 5 gross elements: earth, water, fire, air, and ether, and 3 subtle elements: mind, intelligence, and ego. When one attains liberation, he is freed from these material coverings. Indeed, success in yoga involves getting free from these material coverings and entering into spiritual existence. Lord Buddha's teachings of nirvana are based on this principle. Lord Buddha instructed his followers to give up these material coverings by means of meditation and yoga. Lord Buddha did not give any information about the soul, but if one follows his instructions strictly, he will ultimately become free from the material coverings and attain nirvana. When a living entity gives up the material coverings, he remains a spirit soul. This spirit soul must enter into the spiritual sky to merge into the Brahman effulgence. Unfortunately, unless the living entity has information of the spiritual world and the Vaikunthas, there is 99.9% chance of his falling down again into material existence. There is, however, a small chance of being promoted to a spiritual planet from the Brahman effulgence, or the Brahmajyoti. This Brahmajyoti is considered by impersonalists to be without variety, and the Buddhists consider it to be void. In either case, whether one accepts the spiritual sky as being without variety or void, there is none of the spiritual bliss which is enjoyed in the spiritual planets, the Vaikunthas or Krishna Loka. In the absence of varieties of enjoyment, the spirit soul gradually feels an attraction to enjoy a life of bliss, and not having any information of Krishna Loka or Vaikuntha Loka, he naturally falls down to material activities in order to enjoy material varieties. Oh, and Srila Prabhupada mentioned that there's a small chance of being promoted to a spiritual planet from the Brahman effulgence. I can't remember where I heard this, but yeah, I heard somebody say, maybe it was one of our acharyas, say that Narad Muni, or somebody like Narad Muni, sometimes they'll travel through the Brahmajyoti, through the effulgence of the Vaikuntha planets, and do kirtan, and from coming in contact with Narad Muni, hearing this kirtan, that stage, then they're able to be promoted to a spiritual planet. Kanyakashe dravam toye yatastanam vibhagasha chittimam basitate jasya vayo napasyamum. In this way, according to the different positions of the various parts of the body, Pṛthu Maharaj merged the holes of his senses with the sky, his bodily liquids such as blood and various secretions with the totality of water, and he merged earth with water, then water with fire, fire with air, and air with sky, and so on. 1 second. In this verse, the two words are very important: yatastanam and vipagasha. In Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam, 2nd canto, 5th chapter, Lord Brahma clearly explained to Narad how the creation took place, and he explained one step after another the proper divisions of the senses, the controller of the senses, and the objects of the senses, and the material elements, and he also explained how they are created one after another: the air from the sky, the fire from the air, the water from the fire, the earth from the water, etc. It is important to know thoroughly the process of creation as it applies to this cosmic manifestation. Similarly, this body is also created according to the same process by the Supreme Lord. The personality of Godhead, after entering the universe, creates the cosmic manifestations one after another. Similarly, the living entity, after entering a womb of a mother, also collects his gross and subtle bodies, taking ingredients from the totality of sky, air, fire, water, and earth. The words yatastanam vibhagasha indicate that one should know the process of creation and should meditate upon the creative process inversely, and thus become free from material contamination. Indriyeshu manastani tanmatreshu yatodbhavam bhuttadina munutkrishya mahatatmani sandate. He amalgamated the mind with the senses, and the senses with the sense objects, according to their respective positions. And he also amalgamated the material ego with the total material energy, the Mahat Tattva. Purport: in respect to the ego, the total material energy is sundered in two parts, one agitated by the mode of ignorance, and the other agitated by the modes of passion and goodness. Due to agitation by the mode of ignorance, the 5 gross elements are created. Due to the agitation of the mode of passion, the mind is created, and due to the agitation of the mode of goodness, false egoism or identification with matter is created. The mind is protected by a particular type of demigod. Sometimes the mind, the mana, is also understood to have a controlling deity or demigod. In this way, the total minds, namely the material minds controlled by material demigods, was amalgamated with the senses. The senses, in turn, were amalgamated with the sense objects. The sense objects are forms, tastes, smells, sounds, etc. Sound is the ultimate source of the sense objects. The mind was attracted by the senses and the senses by the sense objects, and all of them were ultimately amalgamated in the sky. The creation is so arranged that the cause and effect follow one another. The merging process involves amalgamating the effect with the original cause. Since the ultimate cause in the material world is Mahat-tattva, everything was gradually wound up and amalgamated with the Mahat-tattva. This may be compared to Shunyavad or voidism, but this is the process for cleansing the real spiritual mind or consciousness. When the mind is completely washed of all material contamination, the pure consciousness acts. The sound vibration from the spiritual sky can automatically cleanse all material contaminations, as confirmed by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Chaito Darpana Marjanam. We need only take the advice of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and chant the Hare Krishna mantra to cleanse the mind of all material contamination. And this may be considered the summary of this difficult verse. As soon as the whole material contamination is washed away by this process of chanting, all desires and reactions to material activities become immediately vanquished, and real life, peaceful existence begins. In this age of Kali, it is very difficult to adopt the yogic process mentioned in this verse. Unless one is very expert in such yoga, the best course is to adopt the ways and means of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Shri Krishna Sankirtanam. Thus one can gloriously become free from all material contamination by the simple process of chanting Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Just as life in this material world has its beginning in material sounds, similarly, a spiritual life has its beginning in this spiritual sound vibration. Tam sarva gunavinasyam jive maya maye nyadhat tang chanushayamatmastam asava anushayi puman jnana vairagya viryena sarupasto jahat prabhu. Pṛthu Maharaj then offered the total designation of the living entity. He offered the total designation of the living entity onto the supreme controller of illusory energy. Being released from all the designations by which the living entity became entrapped, he became free by knowledge and renunciation, and by the spiritual force of his devotional service. In this way, being situated in his original constitutional position of Krishna consciousness, he gave up this body as a Prabhu, or a controller of the senses. Purport. As stated in the Vedas, the Supreme Personality of Godhead is the source of material energy. Sorry, I just need to stretch. Okay. Consequently, he is sometimes called Maya Moy, or the Supreme Person, who can create his pastimes through his potency known as the material energy. The jiva, or the individual living entity, becomes entrapped by the material energy by the supreme will of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. In Bhagavad Gita 1861, we understand, Ishvara sarva bhutanam hridesher juna tishtati brahmayam sarva bhutani yantra rudhani mayaya. Ishvar, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, is situated within the heart of all conditioned souls, and by his supreme will, the living entity, or individual soul, gets the facility to lord it over material nature in various types of bodies, which are known as yantra, are the moving vehicle offered by the total material energy Maya. Although the individual living entity, the jiva, and the Lord are both situated within the material energy, the Lord is directing the movements of the jiva soul by offering him different types of bodies through the material energy, and thus the living entity is wandering throughout the universes in various forms of body and becomes implicated in different situations, partaking of the reactions of fruitive activities. When Pṛthu Maharaj became spiritually powerful by the enhancement of his spiritual knowledge, his gyan, and renunciation of material desires, vairagya, he became a Prabhu, or master of his senses, sometimes called a Goswami or Swami. This means that he was no longer controlled by the influence of material energy. When one is strong enough to give up the influence of material energy, he is called Prabhu. In this verse, the word surupastha is also very significant. The real entity of the individual soul lies in understanding or attaining the knowledge that he is eternally a servant of Krishna. This understanding is called surupopalabdhi. By culturing devotional service, the devotee gradually comes to understand his actual relationship with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. This understanding of one's pure spiritual position is called surupopalabdhi. And when one attains that stage, he can understand how he is related with the Supreme Personality of Godhead as a servant or friend, or as a parent or conjugal lover. This stage of understanding is called surupastha. Pṛthu Maharaj realized this surup completely, and it will be clear in the later verses that he personally left this world, or this body, by riding on a chariot sent from Vaikuntha. In this verse, the word Prabhu is also significant. As stated before, when one is completely self-realized and acts according to that position, he can be called Prabhu. The spiritual master is addressed as Prabhupada because he is a completely self-realized soul. The word pada means position, and Prabhupada indicates that he is given the position of Prabhu, or the Supreme Personality of Godhead, for he acts on behalf of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Unless one is a Prabhu, or a controller of the senses, he cannot act as spiritual master, who is authorized by the Supreme Prabhu, or Lord Krishna. The Mahaprabhu, the Supreme Prabhu. And in his verses praising the spiritual master, Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur writes, Shakshad dharitvena samasta shastrar ukta sata bhavyata eva sarvi. I'm just curious because yesterday it cut off 2 lines. Okay, it only has 2 lines. The spiritual master is honored as much as the Supreme Lord because he is the most confidential servitor of the Lord. Thus, Pṛthu Maharaj can also be called Prabhupada, or as described herein, Prabhu. Another question may be raised in this connection. Since Pṛthu Maharaj was a power incarnation of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, a Shaktavesh avatar, why did he have to execute the regulative principles in order to become a Prabhu? Because he appeared on this earth as an ideal king, and because it was the duty of the king to instruct the citizens in the execution of devotional service, he followed all the regulative principles of devotional service in order to teach others. Similarly, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, although Krishna himself, taught us how to approach Krishna as a devotee. It is said, Apani achari bhakti shikainu sabari. Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu instructed others in the process of devotional service by setting the example himself throughout his own personal actions. Similarly, Pṛthu Maharaj, although a Shaktavesh avatar incarnation, still behaved exactly as a devotee in order to achieve the position of Prabhu. Furthermore, surupastha means complete liberation. As it is said in Bhāgavatam 2.10.6, Hitvanyata rupam sarupena vivastiti. When a living entity abandons the activities of Maya and attains the position from which he can execute devotional service, his state is called surupastha, or complete liberation. Arci nama maharagi tatpatnyanu gatavanam sukumaryatararha cha yatpadvyam sparshanam bhuva. The queen, the wife of Pṛthu Maharaj, whose name was Arci, followed her husband into the forest. Since she was a queen, her body was very delicate. Although she did not deserve to live in the forest, she voluntarily touched her lotus feet to the ground. Purport. Because Pṛthu Maharaj's wife was the queen and also a daughter of a king, she never experienced walking on the ground, for queens used to never come out of the palace. They certainly never went to the forest and tolerated all the difficulties of living in the wilderness. In Vedic civilization, there are hundreds of similar examples of such renunciation on the part of queens and dedication to the husband. The goddess of fortune, Mother Sita, followed her husband Ramachandra when he went to the forest. Lord Ramachandra went to the forest in compliance with the order of his father Maharaj Dasharatha, but Mother Sita was not so ordered. Nonetheless, she voluntarily accepted the path of her husband. Similarly, Gandhari, the wife of King Dhritarashtra, also followed her husband into the forest. Being the wives of great personalities like Pṛthu, Lord Ramachandra and Dhritarashtra. Being the wives of great personalities like Pṛthu, Lord Ramachandra, and Dhritarashtra, these were ideal chaste women. Such queens also instructed the general people by showing them how to become a chaste wife and follow the husband in every stage of life. When the husband is king, she sits beside him as the queen, and when he goes to the forest, she also follows, despite having to tolerate all kinds of difficulties in living in the forest. Therefore, it is said here, Atar Arha, that although she did not want to touch her feet to the ground, she nonetheless accepted all difficulties when she went to the forest with her husband. Ativa bharatur vrata dharma nishtaya shrushrushaya charsha deha yatraya navindatartim parikarshita pisa prayaskara sparshanamana nirvriti. Although she was not accustomed to such difficulties, Queen Arci followed her husband in the regulative principles of living in the forest like great sages. She lay down on the ground and ate only fruits. Flowers, and leaves, and because she was not fit for these activities, she became frail and thin. Yet because of the pleasure she derived in serving her husband, she did not feel any difficulties. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur says, Tomar seva dukkha hoye jata, sheo to paramasuka. In your service, any difficulties, any sufferings that arise, becomes the supreme happiness, the paramasuka. Purport. The words Bhartu Vrata Dharma Nishtaya indicates that a woman's duty, or religious principle, is to serve her husband in all conditions. In Vedic civilization, a man is taught from the beginning of his life to become a brahmachari, then an ideal grahastha, then vanaprastha, then sannyasi, and the wife is taught just to follow the husband strictly in all conditions of life. After the period of brahmacharya, a man accepts a householder's life, and the woman is also taught by her parents to be a chaste wife. Thus, when a girl and boy are united, both are trained for a life dedicated to a higher purpose. The boy is trained to execute his duty in accordance with the higher purpose of life, and the girl is trained to follow him. The chaste wife's duty is to keep her husband pleased in householder life in all respects, and when the husband retires from family life, she is to go to the forest and adopt the life of a vanaprastha, or a vanavasi. At that time, the wife is to follow her husband and take care of him, just as she took care of him in the householder life. But when the husband takes the renounced order of life, namely sannyas, the wife is to return home and become a saintly woman, setting an example for her children and daughters-in-law, and showing them how to live a life of austerity. When Chaitanya Mahaprabhu took sannyas, his wife Vishnupriya Devi, although only 16 years old, also took a vow of austerity due to her husband's leaving home. She chanted her beads, and after finishing one round, she collected 1 grain of rice. In this way, as many rounds as she chanted, she received the same number of rice grains, and then cook them and so take prasad. This is called austerity. Even today in India, widows and women whose husbands have taken sannyas follow the principles of austerity, even though they live with their children. Pṛthu Maharaja's wife Arci was steadily determined to execute the duty of a wife, and while her husband was in the forest, she followed him in eating only fruits and leaves and lying down on the ground. Since a woman's body is considerably more delicate than a man's, Queen Arci became very frail and thin, parikarshita. When one engages in austerities, his body generally becomes lean and thin. Becoming fat is not a very good qualification in spiritual life, because a person who is engaged in spiritual life must reduce the comforts of the body, namely eating, sleeping, and mating, to a minimum. Although Queen Arci became very thin from living in the forest according to regulative principles, she was not unhappy, for she was enjoying the honor of serving her great husband. Deham vipanna kila chetanadikam patyu prithivya daitasya chatmana alaksha kinchit cha vilapya sasati chitam ataropayad adrisu sanuni When Queen Arci saw that her husband, who had been so merciful to her and the earth, no longer showed symptoms of life, she lamented for a little while, and then built a fiery pyre on top of a hill and placed the body of her husband on it. Oh, and Indira Mataji, do you have a picture for this in your Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam? If not, I can show the picture in my Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam. It's not a big deal. But if you do, you can send it over and then. Purport. After seeing all the life symptoms in her husband stop, the queen lamented for a while. The word kinchit means for a little while. The queen was completely aware that her husband was not dead, although the symptoms of life, action, intelligence, and sense perception had ceased. As stated in Bhagavad Gita 2.13, Dehi nosmin yatha dehe komaram yauvanam jara tata dehantara praptir dhirastatra namuhyati. As the embodied soul continually passes in this body from boyhood to youth to old age, the soul similarly passes into another body at death. The self-realized soul is not bewildered by such a change. When a living entity transfers from one body to another, a process generally known as death, a sane man does not lament, for he knows that the living entity is not dead, but is simply transferred from one body to another. The queen should have been afraid of being alone in the forest with the body of her husband, but since she was a great wife of a great personality, she lamented for a while, but immediately understood that she had many duties to perform. Thus, instead of wasting her time in lamentation, she immediately prepared a fiery pyre on top of a hill, and then placed the body of her husband on it to be buried. Thanks, Indira Mataji, thanks. Maharaj Pṛthu is described here as Daita, for not only was he the king of the earth, but he treated the earth as his protected child. Similarly, he protected his wife also. It was the duty of the king to give protection to everyone, especially to the earth or land which he ruled, as well as the citizens and his family members. Since Pṛthu Maharaj was a perfect king, he gave protection to everyone, and therefore he is described here as Daita. I'll look at the picture a little bit later, because there's some more. Vidaya, because there's some more descriptions that will be in the picture. Vidaya kritam hridaya kritam hradini jalapluta Tatvodakam Pṛthu udara karmana natva divistang stridashang striparitya viveshavanim dhyayati bhartripado. After this, the queen executed the necessary funerary functions and offered oblations of water. After bathing in the river, she offered obeisances to various demigods. Situated in the sky and the different planetary systems. She then circumambulated the fire, and while thinking of the lotus feet of her husband, entered its flames. Purport. The entrance of a chaste wife into the flames of the pyre of her dead husband is known as sahagaman, which means dying with the husband. This system of sahagaman had been practiced in Vedic civilization from time immemorial. Even after the British period in India, this practice was rigidly observed. But soon it degraded to the point that even when the wife was not strong enough to enter the fire of her dead husband, the relatives would force her to enter. God, Thus this practice had to be stopped. But even today there are still some solitary cases where a wife will voluntarily enter the fire and die with her husband. Even after 1940, we personally knew of a chaste wife who died in this way. Wow. My God, that's so horrible though. Don't even want to think about that. Vilokyanugatam sadvim Pṛthum vira varam patim Tushtuvur varada devar Deva patnya sahasrasha. After observing this brave act performed by the chaste wife of Arci, the wife of the great king Pṛthu, many thousands of the wives of the demigods, along with their husbands, offered prayers to the queen, for they were very much satisfied. Just seeing what verse I'm reading up to, I forgot. There's the picture. Reading up to verse 26, okay. And let me just download this picture that Indira Mataji took. All right, see, there's the... Actually, let's continue reading a little bit more. Korvatya kusumasaram tasmin mandarasanuni na datsvamara turyeshu grinanti sma parasparam. At that time, the demigods were situated on the top of Mandara hill, and all their wives began to shower flowers on the funeral pyre, and began to talk amongst themselves as follows. Devya ucho aho iyam vadur dhanya ya chaivam bhujam patim sarvatmana patim bheje ya gesham shir vadur iva. The wives of the demigods said, "All glories to Queen Arci. We can see that this queen of the great King Pṛthu, the emperor of all the kings of the world, had served her husband with mind, speech, and body, exactly as the goddess of fortune serves the supreme personality of Godhead, Yagesha or Vishnu." Purport. In this verse, the words Yageshwam Shir Vadhu, Eva, indicates that Queen Arci served her husband just as the goddess of fortune serves the supreme personality of Godhead, Vishnu. We can observe that even in the history of this world, when Lord Krishna, the supreme Vishnu, was ruling over Dwarka, Queen Rukmini, who was the chief of all of Krishna's queens, used to serve Lord Krishna personally, in spite of having many hundreds of maidservants to assist her. Similarly, the goddess of fortune in the Vaikuntha planets also serves Narayan personally, although there are many thousands of devotees prepared to serve the Lord. This practice is also followed by the wives of the demigods, and in days past the wives of men, and in days past, The wives of men also followed the same principle. In Vedic civilization, the husband and wife were not separated by such man-made laws as divorce. We should understand the necessity for maintaining family life in human society and should thus abolish this artificial law known as divorce. The husband and wife should live in Krishna consciousness and follow in the footsteps of Lakshmi Narayan or Krishna Rukmini. In this way, peace and harmony can be possible within this world. Shaishanunam vrajaturdvam anuvainyam patim sati Pashyatasman atityarchir durvibhavena karmana. We're ending with this verse. The wives of the demigods continued, "Just see how this chaste lady Arci, by dint of her inconceivable pious activities, is still following her husband upward, as far as we can see." Purport. Both Pṛthu Maharaja's airplane and the airplane carrying Queen Arci were passing out of the vision of the ladies of the higher planetary systems. These ladies were simply astonished to see how Pṛthu Maharaj and his wife achieved such an exalted position. Although they were the wives of the denizens of the higher planetary system, and Pṛthu Maharaj was an inhabitant of an inferior planetary system, the Earth, the king, along with his wife, passed beyond the realms of the demigods and went upward into Vaikuntha Loka. The word urdhvam, upward, is significant here, for the ladies speaking were from the higher planetary systems, which include the moon, sun, and Venus, up to Brahma Loka, or the highest planet. Because Brahma Loka is the spiritual sky, and in that spiritual sky there are innumerable Vaikuntha Lokas. Thus the word urdhvam indicates that the Vaikuntha planets are beyond or above these material planets, and it was these Vaikuntha planets that Pṛthu Maharaj and his wife were going. This also indicates that when Pṛthu Maharaj and his wife Arci abandoned their material bodies in the material fire, they immediately developed their spiritual bodies and entered into spiritual airplanes, which could penetrate the material elements and reach the spiritual sky. Since they were carried by two separate airplanes, it may be concluded that even after being burned in the funeral pyre, they remained separate, individual persons. In other words, they never lost their identity or became void, as imagined by the impersonalists. The ladies in the higher planetary systems were capable of seeing both downward and upward. When they looked down, they could see that the body of Pṛthu Maharaj was being burned and that his wife Arci was entering into the fire. And when they looked upward, they could see how they were being carried in two airplanes into the Vaikuntha Lokas. All of this is possible simply by durvi bhavyena karmana, inconceivable activity. Pṛthu Maharaj was a pure devotee, and his wife, Queen Arci, simply followed her husband. Thus they can both be considered pure devotees, and thus they are capable of performing inconceivable activities. Such activities are not possible for ordinary men. Indeed, ordinary men cannot even take to the devotional service of the Lord, nor can ordinary women maintain such vows of chastity and follow their husbands in all respects. A woman does not need to attain high qualifications, but if she simply follows in the footsteps of her husband, who must be a devotee, then both husband and wife attain liberation and are promoted to the Vaikuntha Lokas. This is evinced by the inconceivable activities of Maharaj Pṛthu and his wife. Alright, that's all for today. Let's look at this picture now that Indira Mataji very kindly took for us. Hey, how come it's not going full screen? Anyways, here is here's the pyre, and on top of the hill, and there are the demigods and the wives of the demigods showering flowers onto the fire, and here are the two airplanes. There's Pṛthu Maharaj in one airplane and Arci Devi in another airplane. Alright. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Ram 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Ram 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 Hare Hare Hari Bol Hari Bol Hari Bol Nitai Gaur Hari Bol Nitai Gaur Hari Bol Hari Bol Hari Bol Hari Bol. Rup Manjari is saying when she was a kid, when I was a kid, we had a board game that was like Monopoly for spiritual life. If you played your cards wrong, too impersonally, you had to hang out in the Brahma Jyoti and merge for a while. That's so cool. Do you know where that game is? That sounds like so much fun. That's what we need. People need to make devotee board games. Alright. Jai Shri Guru Gauranga Gandharvika Giridhari Shri Radha Vinod Bihari Ju Ki Jai. Shri Govinda Gopinath Maran Mohan Ju Ki Jai. Nitya Vishnu Vishnupad Ashtatara Shmad Shila Bhakti Vedanta Narayan Gosai Maharaj Shila Gurudev Ki Jai. Nitya Vishnu Vishnupad Ashtatara Shmad Shila Bhakti Vedanta Vaman Gosai Maharaj Ki Jai. Nitya Vishnu Vishnupad Ashtatara Shmad Shila Bhakti Vedanta Swami Maharaj Shila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Nitya Vishnu Vishnupad Ashtatara Shmad Shila Bhakti Pragyan Keshav Gosai Maharaj Ki Jai. Nitya Vishnu Vishnupad Ashtatara Shmad Shila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Gosai Prabhupada Ki Jai. Nitya Vishnu Maha-Bhagavat Shila Gokshara Babaji Maharaj Ki Jai. Nitya Vishnu Shila Satchidananda Bhakti Vinod Thakur Ki Jai. Nitya Vishnu Vaishnav Sarvabhauma Shila Jagannath Das Babaji Maharaj Ki Jai. Shri Rupa Nugariya Guru Varga Ki Jai. Shri Rupa Sanatan Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jeev Gopal Bhattadash Raghunath Shar Gosai Prabhu Ki Jai. Shri Sarup Damodar Rai Ramanandari Shri Gaur Parshad Vrinda Ki Jai. Namachay Shila Hari Ras Thakur Ki Jai. प्रेम से कहो श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर शिवासरी गौर भक्त वृंद की जाय. श्री क्षेत्र मंडल गौर मंडल ब्रज मंडल मथुर वृंदावन धाम की जाय. सर्व अभिष्ट प्रदात गिरिराज महाराज की जाय. श्री राधा कुंड श्याम कुंड की जाय. श्री मनु देवी गंगा देवी की जाय. श्री तुलसी महारानी वृंद देवी की जाय. श्री भक्ति देवी की जाय. श्री पूर्णमासी योग माया की जाय. श्री गोपेश्वर महादेव की जाय. श्री हरिनाम संकीर्तन की जाय. अनंत कोटि वैष्णव वृंद की जाय. समागत गौर भक्त वृंद की जाय. श्री निताय गौर प्रेमानंदे हरि हरि बोल. वृंदाय तुलसी देवाय प्रियाय केशवश्च कृष्ण भक्ति प्रददेवी सत्यवताय नमो नमः. पंचकल्पतरुभ्यश्च कृपा सिन्धुभ्यैव च पतितानां पावनेभ्यो वैष्णवेभ्यो नमो नमः. Dandavat pranams. Oh, Shri Pṛthu Maharaj ki jai. Shri Arci Maharani ki jai. Grantaraj Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam ki jai. Shri Nitai Gaur Premanande Hari Hari Bol. Alright. Vandai Tulsi Devai Priyai Keshavascha Krishna Bhakti Pradadevi Sattvatai Namo Namaha. Vancha Kalpataruvesha Kripa Sindhubhyeva Cha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Alright, Hari Bol.